Hello there, it's Adrian Goldberg with the Byline podcast from the Byline Times. The Byline Times is what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report, and what telly doesn't tell you. If Tony Blair became famous for promising that things can only get better, Keir Starmer is warning that things can only get worse in the short term at least. Speaking on the day that Oasis announced their comeback, he did look back in anger at 14 years of Conservative government, which he said did untold damage and left behind a financial legacy that Labour hadn't expected.
Things are worse than we ever imagined. In the first few weeks, we discovered a £22 billion black hole in the public finances. And before anyone says, oh, this is just performative or playing politics, let's remember the OBR did not know about it. They wrote a letter setting that out. And they didn't know because the last government hid it. And even last Wednesday, just last Wednesday, we found out that thanks to the last government's recklessness, we borrowed almost £5 billion more than the OBR expected in the last 3 months alone. That's not performative, that's fact.
Here's Starmer there, setting the scene for a tough October budget. He's already removed winter fuel payments for all but the poorest pensioners. So are we now living through Austerity 2.0? I'm joined by Byline Times chief reporter Josiah Mortimer and Denisha Kazi. Denisha is head of economics at Positive Money, which campaigns for a fairer economical system. Josiah, I think this speech had been pretty heavily trailed, but he's laying it on thick, isn't he, really? We're going to have some bad news, or many people are going to have bad news in the October budget, presumably in terms of tax rises of some description and no immediate extra cash for public services by the sounds of it.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, you heard him repeat over and over again phrases like 14 years of rot, decade of decline. I mean, you get the gist from those phrases, what the Prime Minister was talking about, which is basically setting out very mood music for the next budget on 30th of October, like you say. I mean, this is going to be Labour's first budget in 14, 15 years. And I think it could well be the grimmest for quite a few decades, really. I suppose a lot of people, there's this idea perhaps that Labour's first budget, they kind of get all of the grim stuff out of the way, heavy on cuts and tax rises, and then maybe later on in the Parliament, they can start to give some of that money back. But I think the reason he is talking about this 22 billion black hole is, as I say, because he wants to basically lay the groundwork for cuts and tax rises. And the question for a lot of voters, I think, is we've had austerity for well over a decade. Is this, like you say, Adrian, just going to be austerity with a red rosette attached to it?
Indeed. And on this podcast and through the Byline Times generally, we've highlighted some of the devastating effects of austerity on the economy. If you take money out of the economy, if you give people less money to spend, then that can have a terrible effect in all sorts of ways. So for a Labour Prime Minister effectively to be warning of more of that, that's pretty scary. Many people will say it's not what they voted for.
Yeah, he did try and counter that, the Prime Minister, by talking about the fact that the burden of perhaps the cuts or tax rises to come are going to fall on, in his words, those with the broadest shoulders. Another point, I guess, of perhaps hopefulness is that Keir Starmer did commit to sticking to his pre-election promise, which was not to hike income tax, national insurance, VAT. But on the flip side, that does sort of close off a lot of his room for manoeuvre. One thing I did find interesting, and again, perhaps something that does make the whole speech maybe a bit less gloomy than it could be, is that he didn't rule out taxes on wealth. Now, a lot of people talk about a wealth tax, a sort of one-off tax on all wealth in the economy. But I think Labour are basically moving away from that idea or ruling that out. But what they could do is things like increase capital gains tax when assets are sold, so stocks and shares. And that's currently taxed way less than income is taxed, which is effectively a subsidy for the most well off. Not many people pay capital gains tax, so that's something that's on the cards. And of course, also talking about clamping down on non-domiciled tax exiles. And there's been a bit of talk about, tightening up inheritance tax thresholds and things like that. So it could be that this next Labour budget is more focused on clawing some of that money back from the most well off. But as we've seen with the changes to winter fuel payment, the government's made it much, much tighter who can claim that. So this is looking like an austerity budget that's going to come.
Danisha, if you were in number 11 Downing Street, could you find more scope for hope than we've been promised by Keir Starmer?
I think absolutely, yes. I think the biggest learning we've had from the last 14 years is that austerity doesn't work. It's been so damaging for the economy in a structural sense. We've got crumbling public services and infrastructure, and this whole kind of austerity language that's being presented, that they've inherited this bleak economy and they have to make these tough choices. I think it's kind of doubling down on that same language, but with a different spin. And that's what needs to be pushed back on. I think we do have lots of different options available to us that they should be honest about us being able to talk about them. There should be more democratic discussion about these issues. We know, for example, that governments can borrow more cheaply than individuals and businesses. It's a fact, and we've seen during the pandemic, for example, emergency measures that we never thought were possible. So it's possible to do things through the government that you won't be able to see individual households being able to do or businesses being able to do. And I think we should be able to talk about the scope of those possibilities. I think also it's worth noting that Josiah mentioned wealth taxes. There is a range of possibilities there as well. And they've narrowed the scope down on that, I think, by just sort of talking about increasing capital gains tax. I mean, we should be equalising capital gains tax with income tax. It just should be bolder across the board with whatever they're talking about in terms of an economic reform agenda. So, for example, Tax Justice UK have done some work on this, and they proposed 10 different tax reforms that could bring in significant amounts of money, I think 60 billion into the economy, to help deal with public services, infrastructure, and to reignite the economy. It would be really hard for the Labour government to achieve growth without actually starting to invest in the economy, in our public services, and in people. I don't think that they can talk about growth without sort of plugging that investment gap. We know that the UK has amongst the lowest investment in the G7. So there are lots of possibilities. And I think the wealth tax issue has more mileage. We should be talking much more about that possibility. We've talked about, for example, tax on banks who've made huge profits during this time, this period of higher interest rates. They've made huge unearned profits, and we've talked about, being able to tax the banks for that. There's also corporations that have made huge profits from the pandemic and onwards during the cost of living crisis. There's a lot more billionaires have been created during a cost of living crisis and the pandemic. So, there's lots of sources where the distribution of income has become so unequal. There is scope for a range of wealth taxes that are actually much fairer to implement now. There's a strong case for them, and I think people have an appetite for it now.
I guess as a Labour government, they'll be terrified of borrowing more. They're sticking at the moment within the conventional definitions of government debt. They don't want to hand the Tories an electoral gift, do they, by saying, oh, look, it's the same old Labour borrowing to spend again?
Yeah, I think we also need to start having a grown-up adult conversation about debt and the sustainability of debt, the fiscal rules. A range of economists and experts in the field have now come out and sort of critically talked about the fiscal rules. They're not fit for purpose. So we should be going back to basics and actually talking about these fiscal rules and the conditions and straitjacket they're leaving us with in terms of making these apparently bleak decisions. If the fiscal rules aren't fit for purpose, why are we making decisions about spending on them and cuts? I mean, one sensible idea was to remove public investment banks from the fiscal rules. And there are other ways we can be looking at adapting the fiscal rules in a new sort of context, post-pandemic, cost of living crisis. We've got multiple systemic crises that the world face in terms of climate change and inflationary pressures and energy crises. So we could be looking at sort of adapting the fiscal rules for a new world and a new kind of economic context. So sticking to the old fiscal rules, which we know don't work, which we also know had changed multiple times, like in the last decade, more than 10 times, I don't know. They've changed to fit the political situation. So we know that we need to go back to basics to talk about that as well.
Yeah, Josiah, it's interesting that my sense is that there isn't any appetite either from Keir Starmer or from Rachel Reeves, his Chancellor, to address this in the way that Denisha is suggesting at the moment. They may perhaps have boxed themselves in, but they are sticking to the pre-election rhetoric, which is that these are the spending rules. We're going to stick to them. And if that means tough decisions have to be made, we're going to make them. A sense perhaps even that I wouldn't say they enjoy making those tough decisions, but it's an opportunity for Labour to demonstrate that it is willing to be hard in economic terms and not simply give all of its supporters everything they want.
Yeah, that's right. I think, as Denisha said, it is this idea of boxing themselves in. I mean, specifically on the fiscal rules, I think the main one that is the biggest roadblock to sort of proper investment and dealing with the crisis in our public services is that Labour have pledged to get debt falling as a percentage of GDP, so everything that the country makes in a year within the next 5 years. So basically at the end of this parliament. And that's the same sort of policy that the last government signed up to. Now, the last government spending plans to get there were basically completely pie in the sky. And they left, as Labour now says it's discovering, this sort of black hole of billions and billions of pounds every single year. Now, the Institute for Fiscal Studies and other think tanks before the election, they did know about this particular one and that it would lead to potentially really big cuts if it wasn't addressed to public services around, I think, £18 billion a year, which is not insubstantial. But Labour, in refusing to sort of loosen up that rule, they have really put a rod on their own back. Now, they could, in the next budget in October, as Denisha mentioned, they could take out sort of Bank of England transactions from that. That might give them theoretically 10 or 20 billion pounds to play around with. But at the end of the day, there's an economist and former political advisor, Sam Friedman, has worked out, in order to actually properly invest in public services, we're looking at needing to fill a gap of something like 40 or 50 billion pounds a year, which is enormous. And it's very hard to sort that out without things like raising income tax or VAT, which, as we all know, Labour have refused to budge on. So they have made it very difficult for themselves in that by being super cautious before the election, wanting to present themselves as this party of fiscal responsibility. They haven't given themselves much breathing room. And they are, of course, relying on this idea that growth will get Britain out of the slump. Well, it's very hard to grow if you're not investing in that crucial infrastructure that all those jobs and businesses rely on.
Just to echo that point, the language of growth, it doesn't make sense if we're not going to deal with some of these deeper structural problems the economy has suffered from for a long time because of lack of investment. And they really need to kind of answer these difficult questions. They're presenting it as difficult questions around cuts, pitting pensioners against fixing schools. And I think that is a sort of false narrative they're creating, a false discussion. What they should be talking about is how do we really deal with these long-term structural issues and try and have an honest conversation about that. Obviously, these things do cost something, so they need to talk about what options there are for doing that. Think in terms of a bold economic reform agenda, not limiting themselves to what we've been doing for the last 14 or so years, which just clearly hasn't worked. I mean, I think it's one thing people do know is that austerity in its different forms we've seen it in is not worked. It's led us to where we are now. They've made a lot about they've inherited this terrible economic situation from the Tories, but they're not being honest about why it's terrible, right? And it's because of austerity. So if they're presenting this as further reasons for more austerity, by stealth, it's a really kind of circular argument. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't stack up. And I think people will realise this. They might have some kind of mileage for now, but how long will that be? People voted for change, so they're going to want to see that.
The riots were addressed by Keir Starmer, and he talked about the conditions for the riots having been laid by the Conservatives. But if you look at the issue of levelling up and left behind communities, You could argue very strongly, I think, that they were the product of austerity. So at the same time as talking about the Conservatives creating the conditions in which rioters developed a motivation to riot, there's no evidence in what Keir Starmer has said that Labour will offer any positive alternative anytime soon.
Yeah, and I think also disappointing for them to talk about it in a sort of vacuum, kind of detached from the economic conditions and social conditions we've been experiencing for over a decade.
I mean, it's sorry to interrupt there, because he has spoken previously, hasn't he, about the divisiveness of language, the culture wars that Conservatives engaged in, and that almost certainly is part of the problem. But it's not the only part of the problem. There is an economic situation underlying this.
I mean, austerity does create division in society. It creates extreme inequality, and it's been very damaging. And studies are continuing to kind of detail to the extent to which it's damaged society. Incomes have stagnated dramatically for over a decade, and people's quality of living standards have been eroded away. So this is definitely going to have an impact. At the same time, we're seeing corporations make huge profits, many billionaires being created during the most toughest times we've experienced, such as lockdown and cost of living crisis. And to avoid talking about policies that can actually directly address that by making society fairer, by making the economy fairer through taxing unearned incomes and wealth by these large corporations and banks, just seems terrible kind of optics. It seems like they're not understanding what the public need to see right now, need to hear. They need to hear that they're going to be supported through what has been difficult times. We've seen recent data on food prices, how much they've gone up significantly, and partly to do with the fact that there's such a concentration of large food corporations that can charge higher prices. And we need to see that we've got a government that can step in to talk about the different possible policies that can be used to protect people from things like that. They've got a wide toolbox to draw from, not just higher interest rates to deal with inflation, or tax and spend policies to stick within these kind of made up fiscal rules. I think we just need to see a lot more of a bolder and imaginative economic set of policies so that people can see that they're actually putting their faith in people that can manage the economy well and better.
And we've got an energy price rise coming, Josiah. Any signs of the imaginative thinking in the Labour Party that Denisha has hinted at coming from anybody in Keir Starmer's circle?
Yeah, I think almost to offer a counterpoint to what I was saying earlier about the doom and gloom. I mean, Keir Starmer did kind of preempt some of that by talking about some of the stuff Labour has already been doing, some of which doesn't involve spending huge amounts of money, which is obviously something that the PM is very keen to avoid. But things like renationalising the railways, planning reform to get through renewable energy projects through the door much quicker, and also setting up GB Energy. So the government gamble when it comes to energy price rises we've just been talking about is that by having this publicly owned energy company that's investing in directly in renewable energy projects, they can in the sort of medium to long term bring down energy prices for all of us. But at the same time, they aren't offering to sort of step in and stop that big hike coming in the winter to fuel bills. So it feels like the narrative is very much doing what they can with as little money being spent as possible, again, to avoid these claims from the Tories that they're borrowing to excess and things like that. The other one, I suppose, is this National Wealth Fund, which is a kind of partner, I suppose, to GB Energy. So investing in British industry and basically acting a bit like a sort of Northern European or Scandinavian investment house that's owned by the taxpayer. Some of this stuff has been massively scaled down compared to what they were talking about before the general election. There was a previous claim that they were going to spend £28 billion a year on green infrastructure investment. That was, of course, then scaled down significantly. But there are still, I think, efforts, particularly coming from people like Ed Miliband, the climate secretary, to try and make sure that there is still bold ideas in the mix. And I suppose if people are looking for hope, which is very understandable, then they'll be looking to some of those voices around the cabinet table who are saying, look, we need to not just offer the stick, but also the carrot too.
Josiah, thank you. Chief reporter for Byline Times. Don't forget you can read him in the Byline Times, our fabulous monthly news periodical, and online at bylinetimes.com, and or the Byline supplement, which I would recommend to you as well. And thanks also to Denisha Kazi, Head of Economics at Positive Money. Before we go, just a reminder to check out bylineaudio.com. It's our new audio platform at Byline Times. Has some fantastic output there. You can listen to Adventures in Americana with Hardeep Matharu and Bonnie Greer, two wonderful broadcasters, and some fascinating insights into the United States. And Otto English and John Mitchinson presenting Utter Bollocks, a wonderful myth-busting podcast looking at some popular theories and puncturing them with great wit and imagination. So do head over to bylineaudio.com. We'll see you again very soon. But for now, thank you for listening. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Byline Audio.